What if I told you that everything you've been taught about following Jesus is wrong? What if he didn't want followers at all? What if he wanted something far more profound? In today's video, we will explore a radical shift in understanding Jesus' call to follow me. What if the true meaning behind those words was about personal transformation, not just adherence to a doctrine? We'll dive into the cultural context of Jesus' time, what follow me really meant, and how we can apply this deeper understanding of his teachings to our lives today. Let's uncover the truth behind Jesus' mission. 1. The traditional view of following Jesus. For many, following Jesus means attending church, reading the Bible, praying before meals, and trying to be a good person. It often involves following certain rituals, believing specific doctrines, and looking to Jesus as a leader and savior. Church teachings typically emphasize these external practices as the primary way to live out one's faith. This view of following Jesus evolved over centuries, especially after the time of the apostles. Initially, Christianity was a dynamic movement of personal transformation, where believers experienced a direct, intimate connection with God. However, as Christianity spread and institutionalized, these transformative experiences were replaced with more structured practices. By the time of the early church councils, the focus had shifted to doctrines and rituals that could be standardized and controlled by the institution. While these practices are not inherently bad, they miss the core of what Jesus wanted. The traditional view of following Jesus often reduces faith to a set of actions or external observances, but it can neglect the deeper, more personal awakening that Jesus truly desired for his followers. Following rituals without internal transformation can lead to a shallow relationship with God, one that remains on the surface instead of diving deep into the divine experience he wanted for each of us. It's time to challenge the assumption that simply following external practices is enough. Jesus didn't just want us to follow a set of rules or rituals. He wanted us to experience an inner transformation, a reawakening to the divine presence already within us. Instead of being passive followers, we are called to actively engage with the deeper meanings of his teachings. This shift calls for us to examine our own lives. Are we just going through the motions of religious practices, or are we allowing Jesus' words to awaken something much more profound inside us? This deeper understanding of Jesus' call to follow me invites us to stop being passive observers of faith and start becoming active participants in our own spiritual awakening. 2. The true meaning of follow me in first-century Judaism. When Jesus said, "Follow me," he wasn't merely asking people to walk behind him like followers in a crowd. The word follow, in the first-century Jewish context, meant something much more profound and transformative. It wasn't about simply adhering to a set of external behaviors or beliefs. It was about becoming like the rabbi, embodying the rabbi's way of life, character, and inner wisdom. In Jewish tradition, a rabbi didn't just teach his disciples information. A disciple's job was to become the living reflection of the rabbi, to internalize his character and way of being. The relationship wasn't about mere knowledge or rules, but about a deeper, more intimate connection. Disciples aimed to become like their rabbi in every way, not just in action, but in their consciousness, in their thoughts, their words, their relationships with others, and most importantly, in their connection with the divine. When Jesus called his disciples to follow me, he was inviting them into this intimate relationship. He wasn't saying, "Be my fan," or "Be my follower from a distance." He was saying, "Become what I am. Become one with the consciousness that I embody." This wasn't about religious rituals or doctrinal adherence. It was about transformation. Jesus was inviting his followers to step into a new reality, where they would recognize the divine spark within themselves and embody the same divine nature he demonstrated. This perspective of following challenges the way we understand faith today. Instead of being passive believers who merely mimic rituals and traditions, Jesus calls us to actively engage in a spiritual journey where we become the embodiment of his love, compassion, and divine consciousness. Following him isn't about a blind adherence to a religious system, but about awakening to the truth within us. This deeper meaning of follow me invites us into an active personal relationship with Jesus, a relationship where we are not just trying to be good followers, but rather seeking to become who he is. The call to follow Jesus is ultimately a call to awaken to our true divine nature and live in a way that reflects his consciousness on earth. Jesus didn't want followers in the traditional sense. He wanted disciples who would become like him, living expressions of the divine presence. 3. Jesus' criticism of religious leaders. Throughout his ministry, Jesus had no hesitation in calling out the religious leaders of his time. The Pharisees and Sadducees were often the targets of his sharp words. They were the ones who outwardly appeared righteous, following every rule and ritual to the letter, but inside, they lacked the true transformation that Jesus desired. Jesus didn't mince words. He called them hypocrites, blind guides, and whitewashed tombs. What Jesus criticized wasn't their outward observance of religious laws, but their failure to live from the deeper essence of those laws. He said that they focused so much on following the letter of the law that they missed the spirit of it entirely. They were so caught up in performing rituals and following external rules that they neglected the most important commandment: love. Love for God and love for one another. In contrast to these religious leaders, Jesus emphasized a personal, inward transformation. He didn't want a group of people who simply followed him because he was a charismatic leader. He didn't want people to mimic his actions on the outside without experiencing the change on the inside. He came to awaken the heart and the spirit, not just the body. The faith he preached wasn't about rituals, laws, or sacrifices. It was about a transformation of the heart that leads to a new way of living, one that reflects God's love in every action, every relationship, and every thought. Jesus understood that true religion isn't about the performance of rituals or following a list of rules. It's about becoming a reflection of the divine love that God has for all people. This criticism of religious leaders still applies to us today. Many of us go through the motions of faith, church on Sundays, prayer before meals, following certain rules. But do we miss the heart of it? Are we living from a place of genuine transformation? Or are we merely going through a religious performance? Jesus calls us to more than that. He calls us to awaken to the divine presence within us, to love with his heart, and to embody his teachings, not just with our actions, but with our entire lives. When we get caught in the cycle of religious duty without the true transformation of the heart, we miss the point of what Jesus really wanted. His call to follow me wasn't just an invitation to adhere to a set of rules. It was a call to awaken to the love, grace, and divine consciousness that is already inside of us. 4. The invitation to become what I am. When Jesus called his disciples to follow me, he wasn't just asking them to trail behind him or become his devoted followers. He was extending an invitation to a much deeper transformation. His call wasn't about worship from a distance. It was about becoming who he was. Jesus wanted his disciples and all who came after them to embody the same divine consciousness that he embodied. His mission was to show them that the very qualities they admired in him, the love, the compassion, the wisdom, the power, were not unique to him, but were within every human being. In the rabbinic tradition, when a disciple followed a teacher, it wasn't just about learning information. It was about becoming like the teacher in every way. A disciple's goal was to embody the life and essence of their rabbi. Jesus, however, took this tradition even further. He wasn't simply calling his followers to learn from him. He was inviting them to become him. Follow me wasn't an invitation to be an eternal student. It was an invitation to be transformed, to become the very reflection of the divine presence that he embodied. This radical message meant that Jesus wasn't asking for obedience in the traditional sense, obedience to rules and rituals. He was asking for a radical internal transformation where his disciples, and we as his followers, would recognize our own divine potential. The goal was not to admire Jesus from afar, but to realize that the same love, the same power, the same presence of God that lived in him could live in us. Jesus said, "Greater works than these will you do." Think about that. He wasn't being modest, he was being prophetic. He was telling his disciples that they could do more than he had done. He wasn't pointing to his unique abilities as something to worship. He was pointing to the divine potential in each of us. If we truly understood this, we would stop seeing ourselves as mere followers of Jesus and begin to see ourselves as active participants in his divine mission. Imagine what would happen if we lived this way, if we recognize that the divine consciousness that Jesus demonstrated is available to us right now, not as something distant, but as something deeply embedded in our being. We are invited to awaken, not to follow from a distance, but to embody what Jesus modeled in our daily lives. This shift from being a follower to becoming what Jesus embodied is at the core of his teachings. It challenges us to stop seeing Jesus as someone separate from us and start seeing him as the model for what we are meant to become. Jesus' call wasn't to follow him. It was to become him in the world, to live as he lived, to love as he loved, and to awaken to the divine truth within us all. 5. The shift from awakening to religious institutions. Over time, something significant shifted in the Christian faith. What began as a dynamic movement of awakened beings seeking to live in divine consciousness gradually became institutionalized. The living, breathing presence of Christ in the hearts of believers transformed into something more static and manageable, a religion built on structure, rules, and external rituals. The power of personal transformation began to be replaced by the idea that one needed an institution, an intermediary, or a specific set of beliefs to experience God. Initially, the early Christian community was vibrant, full of life, and marked by direct experiences of divine connection. Those who followed Jesus did not merely listen to him, they experienced his teachings and his presence. Their connection to the divine was immediate and personal. But as the years passed, and particularly after the death of the apostles, the direct living experience of the divine began to fade. Christianity became formalized. The church structures grew, and with them came a more controlled narrative of faith. The church began to shift from a path of personal awakening to a path of following prescribed rules. Instead of seeing Jesus as a model for transformation, he was increasingly viewed as a distant figure to be revered and worshipped. Personal spiritual awakening was exchanged for institutionalized practices. People no longer sought the divine consciousness that Jesus embodied within themselves. Instead, they were taught to follow religious leaders and adhere to rituals, thinking that this was the only way to access God. This institutionalization is perhaps one of the greatest changes that the church underwent. It made the divine seem far away, something to be accessed only through the right systems and rituals. The kingdom of heaven, which Jesus taught was within each of us, was replaced by a far-off kingdom, one that could only be reached by following the proper steps and rituals laid out by the church. What was once a transformative living faith became a controlled system of belief, where salvation was more about adhering to the rules than about awakening to the divine truth within. For many, this shift has been damaging. Instead of living as Christ lived, we began to follow formulas, believing that faith was about church attendance, reciting prayers, and following rituals, rather than about internal transformation. Jesus' invitation was to awaken to the divine presence within us, not to follow rules and rituals mindlessly. The shift from an awakened faith to an institutionalized one diluted the power of Jesus' message, replacing the living flame with stone structures and fixed systems. But the original message of awakening never truly went away. It still lives within us, waiting to be rediscovered. This is why it's so important for us to reflect on what it means to follow Jesus today. It's time to move beyond the external practices and return to the essence of his teachings, awaken to the kingdom within, and begin living as he lived. 6. The moment of transformation for the disciples. It wasn't until after the resurrection that the disciples truly understood what Jesus had been trying to teach them all along. For 3 years, they followed him, listened to his teachings, and witnessed his miracles. They saw him as their leader, their rabbi, and they believed his divine consciousness was something unique to him. They respected him as the Son of God. but still viewed him as separate from themselves. But when Jesus was crucified, everything they believed was shattered. Their hopes, their expectations, and their understanding of who Jesus was came crashing down. They were terrified, confused, and heartbroken. The one who had promised to save them, to redeem the world, was dead. How could this be? What did it all mean? Then the unimaginable happened. Jesus appeared to them. This was not just some resurrection miracle. This was the moment that would change everything. When he appeared to his disciples, he didn't come to say, "Look, I'm special. Worship me now." He didn't return to prove his power or divine nature. No, he came back to reveal something far more profound. In his resurrection appearances, Jesus showed the disciples that what they had seen in him was not exclusive to him. He demonstrated his ability to transcend space, to walk through walls, to appear and disappear at will. These were not just miraculous signs. They were signs of what was possible for all of us when we fully awaken to our divine nature. When Jesus said, "As the Father has sent me, so I send you," he wasn't just commissioning them to spread his teachings. He was transferring his consciousness to them. He was empowering them to do what he had done, not as followers, but as living embodiments of his message. He breathed the Holy Spirit into them and told them, "Receive the Holy Spirit." This was the pivotal moment when the disciples understood. They were not meant to follow Jesus from a distance. They were meant to embody what he was and do the very works he did. For the first time, they realized that Jesus wasn't calling them to simply follow him. He was inviting them to become like him. He wasn't a figure to worship from afar, but a model to be lived, a consciousness to be embodied. The disciples were no longer followers. They were now equal participants in the divine consciousness of Christ. This moment of awakening is what changed everything. The resurrection wasn't about one man coming back to life. It was about the potential for every human being to awaken to the divine nature within themselves. The transformation was not external, but internal. Jesus had shown them the path of awakening, and now it was their turn to walk it. For us, the call is the same. Jesus didn't want followers. He wanted mirrors, living reflections of the divine presence. And just like the disciples, we are invited to awaken to the truth within ourselves and become the living expression of the consciousness Jesus demonstrated. We are not meant to worship from a distance. We are meant to embody the very presence of Christ in our lives. 7. The call to become. Not just follow Jesus' teachings were never about creating a system of worship or a religion of blind obedience. He came to awaken something far deeper, our divine potential. His message was always about becoming, not following. He wanted us to embody the divine consciousness he demonstrated, to live as he lived, and to experience the same connection to God that he had. This was not about worshiping him as a distant figure. It was about realizing that the same spirit that lived in him is also within us. For centuries, however, this profound message has been distorted. Over time, Christianity shifted from a living, awakening faith to an institutionalized system of worship. The message of transformation was buried beneath rituals, doctrines, and authority. The shift from becoming to following led to a passive faith where people were told what to believe and how to practice their faith instead of being empowered to experience the divine for themselves. The early Christians, however, understood the true meaning of Jesus' words. They didn't see Jesus as someone to worship from afar. They saw him as the ultimate model of what they could become. His life was a living example of divine consciousness in action, and he called them, and us, to embody that same divine presence. When Jesus said, "Follow me," he wasn't calling us to become his disciples in the traditional sense, to become his followers for life. He was calling us to become like him, to awaken to the truth of who we are. He wanted us to be living expressions of the kingdom of heaven right here, right now. The question then is, how do we live this out today? How do we shift from being followers to being embodiments of divine consciousness? It starts with understanding that we are not separate from Christ. We are in him, and he is in us. It's about awakening to the kingdom that resides within us right now. Jesus taught that the kingdom of heaven is not a distant place but a present reality, accessible to anyone who is willing to awaken to it. This radical shift, moving from following to becoming, calls us to stop seeing Jesus as an object of worship and start seeing him as the model for our own transformation. It means realizing that his life wasn't just a miraculous story, but a blueprint for how we can live. Just as he was connected to the Father, so too can we be connected to God, embodying his love, compassion, and wisdom in every moment of our lives. Now, more than ever, the world needs awakened beings who know their divine nature. The time for followers is over. The age of awakening has begun, and it starts with each one of us. Are we ready to step into our true calling, to stop following and start becoming? Conclusion. As we reflect on the journey we've just explored, one thing becomes abundantly clear. Jesus didn't want followers. He wanted living reflections of divine consciousness. He didn't come to establish a religion of rituals, but to awaken humanity to the truth that the kingdom of heaven is within us all. His words, "Follow me," were not an invitation to worship him as a distant leader, but a call to embody the divine presence he demonstrated in his life. The realization that Jesus called us to become what he was, to awaken to the divine consciousness within us, challenges us to look beyond the surface of religion. It forces us to ask ourselves, are we content with following the rituals, or are we ready to embrace the transformation he envisioned? Are we willing to stop seeing him as someone separate and begin recognizing his divine presence within our own hearts? This is the key to living the life of a true disciple. Not to worship from afar, but to become the living embodiment of the love, wisdom, and grace he offered to the world. As you take this new understanding into your life, let it reshape your daily walk with God. The world no longer needs more followers who simply adhere to rules. It needs more people who recognize their divine nature and live from that place of awakened consciousness. I encourage you to stop merely following Jesus and instead start embodying his consciousness in every aspect of your life. Whether it's through love, kindness, forgiveness, or simply being present, your actions can reflect the divine truth that he shared with us. If this video has awakened something within you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's engage in a meaningful discussion about how we can all embody Christ's consciousness in our lives. And if this message resonated with you, share this video with others who might be ready to stop following and start becoming. How do you think the shift from following to becoming changes the way we practice our faith? Have you experienced a deeper connection to Jesus beyond traditional worship and rituals? Share your thoughts below, and let's dive deeper into how we can all embody Christ's consciousness in our lives.